So capitalism is a political and economical system where the industry and the trade of a country is run by the private sector for profit, and there's no intervention of the state. Obviously, that is a bit extreme, and our modern economies are not to that state. There's still government intervention and regulation in place, but the pandemic still has shown some weak points which have to be addressed in the future. Nonetheless, the private sector during the pandemic has been a great help. As we have seen at the beginning, there have been a lot of manufacturing lines that have been adapted, supply chains have been adapted, and a lot of effort was put by private companies to produce essential goods such as masks, hydroalcoholic gels, etc., in order to really help everyone, not without a focus on profit, just in order to get through the pandemic. However, this effort was still very individual and unique to companies. And there was a need for someone to coordinate and to really direct the capital and the resources toward ending the pandemic, and that was the state. So the state has proven essential in taking part, gathering all the stakeholders, discussing, and really setting goals and targets in order to reach the end of the pandemic and move forward. So the issue that we are facing is that the capitalistic system that we have with the big focus on the private sector might not be strong enough, as the pandemic has shown, to really cope with important crises like the pandemic was, but also like climate change will be and other crises that can potentially come. So how are we going to do in the future? Especially with pressing issues which are also adding pressure, such as growing inequalities, or also disparate growth with emerging countries and developed countries. So what will capitalism have to do in the future? Will it have to evolve? Will it have to change its focus from profit to something else? Or will we have to move completely to another point? And so these are the questions we're going to touch today and to discuss and see what our panel speakers have an opinion on. And so enough talking on my side, so I'll leave the floor to Ms. Schelp, our moderator for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. Before we start, I would actually welcome the panel members. So thanks, Robert, Helena, and Stefan to be here. I would like to start with Robert. Hi. So Robert is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And I practice the abbreviation quite a lot, so I hope I get it right. You have to tell me, Robert, it's UNCTAD, right? Okay. So earlier in his career, he was a Fulbright professor for environmental issues at University of Aleppo in Syria. Before, he was associate professor for international environmental affairs at the Swiss International Academy of the Environment in Geneva. In 1999, he began collaborating with the UN on trade and environment issues. First with the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, and then with UNCTAD. Robert completed his PhD at Dartmouth College and holds an MBA from the University of Geneva. We are very excited that you are here today, Robert. Thank you. So the next person I want to introduce is Helena Diffo. So Helena Diffo is from Paris, originally from Central African Republic, and she is a debt restructuring associate in the risk and recovery unit of Symbiotics. So for the one that don't know Symbiotics, it's a leading market access platform for impact investing. She's also a young professional program candidate in the Political Affairs and Human Rights Program by the United Nations. Helena completed the bachelor's and master's degree in economics at HEC Lausanne and another master's degree in economics and Islamic finance at Durham University. She's especially interested in microfinance, so I guess we hear a bit more about that. So thanks for being here today. As a last person in our panel is Stefan Legge, and he is lecturer at Hochschule St. Gallen, HSG, and he teaches and publishes in leading journals. So he previously was a postdoctoral researcher in economics at HSG, and before successfully completed his PhD in economics and finance in St. Gallen. His bachelor and master studies he also did in economics, but in Mannheim. And actually, he won an award in 2014 as a Swiss Young Economist Award. So I guess we have very interesting panel members today. So thank you all for being here. And enough talking from my side, I would like to start with the questions. And for all of you that are listening, I have on this side a screen. So you can write, if you have questions, in the chat. And I will ask your questions to the panel members. Obviously, you also have the possibility in the Q&A session afterwards to directly ask. So I would like to start with Helena. So what are the limits and vulnerabilities you see due to the pandemic? I mean, Henry already mentioned some. What is your view?
As Andrew reminded us, actually, so the capitalist society in which we all have been challenged many times already. The past few years, we've been experiencing several crises that have tested the limits of capitalism. And for example, the financial crisis of 2008 was an unfortunate reminder. But now with the COVID-19 crisis, it's different because it's actually a triple crisis, right? We are facing an economic crisis, an environmental crisis, and a societal crisis. And this crisis actually is amplifying all the flows of the capitalist system. And the problem is that now we need to solve these problems, but at the same time, we also need to address the immediate health emergency. So that's for the bad news. But I think that the good news is that we can use the current state of emergency to actually start building a new society, a new system, which is a little bit more inclusive and sustainable. But I think that to talk about a little bit more extensively of the limits of our system, I will hand it over to my co-panelists, Robert and Stefan, who will give you a more comprehensive view.
Thank you, Helena. So I would like to ask Stefan, because you look like, I'm not sure if you really agree. So do you see the current situation really as a crisis or as a state of emergency? Or do you say, well, it's not that of a big deal?
Obviously, it's a big deal. And first of all, hello to everyone. Happy to be here. And of course, it's a big deal. I mean, it's a very unusual situation that so many businesses have to shut down. So many people are not allowed to get out. And if you look at all across the world, you see that basic human rights have been restricted. The right to go out, to demonstrate, to participate in political events. Businesses to open. All of these are basic rights which have been restricted. So it is an extraordinary point in time. But I don't agree that this is such a crisis, such a fundamental crisis. I rather agree with Helena in the sense that it's just another thing that we have to deal with, another challenge that we have to deal with. And unfortunately, and that's the point Helena made very nicely, it comes on top of other challenges that we haven't properly dealt with. If you think about the financial crisis, if you think about the Euro crisis, climate crisis, all of these things are manageable, but we just postpone dealing with them. And I think it comes from a lack of understanding what is actually going on, and invested or vested interests who fight against changes. I mean, climate change wouldn't be that big of a deal to deal with, actually. You have to put a price on CO2 emissions. I mean, how hard is that? But of course, there are a lot of people who don't want that, but it's doable. And I think the pandemic also shows, if you look around the world, there are countries who are able to deal with it, and they're capitalist countries. So it's not like we need more capitalism, less capitalism. We need competent people in charge, whether that's in business or in politics. And I'm sorry, but if you look at, from a Western point of view, you have to look at Asia, Taiwan, Singapore, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. They all managed to keep COVID-19 under control, and we didn't. And they're as capitalist as we are. So I think it's a different problem. It's a challenge it's like many challenges that we have to face today require competence and action, and they have been missing in the past, and in COVID-19 it's a challenging time, and it just shows that competence matters, and we have to deal with the issues because otherwise we will suffer the consequences.
Thank you, Stefan. I want to ask Robert about the environmental part, because you, Stefan, said it would not be such a big deal to deal with our environmental problems. So Robert, you are like researching and working in that field since a long time. Do you agree with that? So if COVID wouldn't be there, it would be easier, or maybe, what is your view?
Okay, well, okay, I listened carefully to both Helena and Stefan, and it's true that it is in a sense a crisis. It's a crisis because of the great changes that it's caused in our lives to undergo this pandemic and to get through it successfully. And as Stefan mentioned, it's competence that's needed, but where is the competence coming from? It's, in my opinion, different countries have performed better than others in surviving and combating the pandemic because of the role of government. And so if we look comparatively at the different situations in different countries, we see that some countries' governments were more proactive and acted more aggressively in order to contain the crisis than others. And so there's a role for government to play. And I think that success in a capitalist system means that government needs to be involved in order to protect and sustain types of resources that don't figure in the investment and the capitalist equation, because the capitalist system is based on investors who are seeking to make an investment over a short time frame, relatively short time frame, to maximize profits. And so they only look at the direct inputs to their scheme. So those direct inputs include capital and labor, and often environment and social situations, social problems are left outside of that equation. Now the time frame is very short, and so because it's a short time frame, they don't need to look at these externalities, these social and environmental externalities. They can focus on the production, the consumption, the equation that's going to bring a return on their investment. And so it's not going to be the investors who look and to try to make the capitalist system better. It's got to be the governments. The governments have a role to play. And I think that what has been nice about the pandemic is that we saw that governments actually started playing a more aggressive role in order to get through this crisis. And I think that unchecked, capitalism could lead to more environmental threats and pandemics, biodiversity loss, climate change, unless governments play a more active role in checking the system, making sure that some of these externalities are no longer external, but they're brought into the investment decision. And they can do that with the proper regulations, the proper policies, the proper, there could be bans, there could be economic instruments that are applied to the economy in order to channel investment in a way that will be sustainable for the future, so that the capitalist system can still reward investors for investment, and that can create jobs, and that can create a better standard of living for people, but at the same time, make sure that that investment is sustainable by putting these checks and balances in place. And so
Thank you, Robert.
That's the way we want to go.
Thank you, Robert. I have a question to Stefan. So you mentioned some countries perform better, like in Asia, for example, in handling the pandemic, and generally also procuring vaccinations. However, Asian countries tend to have less focus on sustainability topics. So isn't there a broader view required? Because at the moment we are looking at like single aspects, and I think to look at the future, the governments or the countries need to perform good in an overall view, not just in single topics. So what's your view on that?
Absolutely. I pointed just out that in dealing with one challenge, we can learn from other countries. And of course, in some other domains, European countries or the United States are doing better. And then other countries can learn from that. I mean, the leading universities of the world are still in the United States, and other countries learn from it. Actually, China learns a lot from the US in that regard. So I fully subscribe to what Robert pointed out. We need competent government. I mean, there is an important role by the public sector to play. It's like a football game. Someone has to define the rules. And if the rules are wrong, if you allow fist fights, then you will have fist fights, because at the end of the day, the footballers want to win the match. Companies want to make a profit. And if you can make a profit by polluting the environment, then someone will do it. So you have to have competent policymakers and in dealing with all kinds of challenges. And in that regard, I think COVID-19 is a little different from other challenges like climate change, because failures by the public sector have immediate consequences. You immediately see COVID-19 cases go up, people dying, hospitals being crowded, and the economy going downward because of everyone being scared, consumer confidence being low. With climate change, there's a much more important maybe problem, long-term problem, but that's also why it's more difficult to deal with it, because failure of action might be rewarded in the short term for companies and the policymakers. So COVID-19 is a nice illustration of, in the sense that we see government intervention matters, competent intervention is required, and otherwise you will have consequences, and the consequences come much faster. And so I think you're right pointing out that in Asia, some countries do better in terms of fighting COVID-19. But I still remember many discussions with Asians about environmental issues, and they have very different views about that to some extent. Sometimes, they don't see it as much of an issue, but then you have to keep in mind what is on their issue, what is on their mind. And if you speak with Chinese, I mean, the average income level is a quarter of what we have in Europe. If you're unemployed in Switzerland, your standard of living is higher than the average Chinese who's working, by the way, and working very hard. And we're not talking about other parts of the world. So of course, Europe has to play a more active role in fighting climate change and other environmental issues, because quite frankly, we can afford it.
So thank you, Stefan. So we have a first question from our audience, so I will read it to you. The one that wants to answer it, the one that is the quickest can start, okay? So do you think that this more active role of the government is going to stay in medium to long term, and if yes, in which areas? Okay, Robert.
Thank you for the question. And I think we can all have maybe a chance to go at it. But I would say that the crisis, the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis, has given, I think, governments confidence to see that they can act, that they can act successfully. And they can see immediately, as Stefan noted, what the consequences are if they don't act quickly and in a determined way. And can this be extended? I think that the sense of confidence that governments have that they should be more involved in issues of public concern, whether it be health or environment, or even human rights, that yes, they have a role to play and they can play it and they can get results. They might not get results quickly with climate change. They might be still under the influence of lobbies organized by investors with a short-term concept of how much money they can make in a short period of time. But they have to overlook that, and they have to be, I think, strong enough and brave enough to resist that and to think in terms of what's best for human welfare of the country as a whole.
Thank you. I think it would be good kind of to close that phase of defining the problems, issues, vulnerabilities, maybe to summarize your main points. So one thing was incompetence, Stefan, right, from your side. Another point was sustainability. I think that came from kind of all of you. I think there are also other issues we maybe didn't mention because we kind of drifted in that direction. I'm just mentioning, for example, global trade was kind of limited or interrupted. Maybe we kind of brainstorm and gather a few more topics before we zoom in on like single aspects. So who wants?
Helena, you want to go first?
I just want to say something. If Helena, please.
No, please forward.
Okay, please. Go ahead.
I think, yes, trade was initially disrupted and we saw trade drop precipitously, but it has since started to recover, and it's recovered because we have a lot of strength in our logistics systems. Our supply chains, if we couldn't manage to continue foreign supply chains to supply us with what we needed, we were able to reinvigorate some of the local supply chains, and that has been a good thing. But I also think that internet and the connectivity that we have has allowed all of us to see that we can continue to work productively. At least all of us here today, we're working at home, but we have internet, we're able to communicate, we're able to continue to have a certain economic activity, even in a low mobility, low contact context. And so the other lesson from all of this is that yes, the economy can survive when it's not running at full steam, but when it's running in a low mobility mode, and when it does that, we can see other strengths of the economy that we didn't know were there beforehand.
Thank you. So the question to Helena is, I mean, we are always talking about growth. I mean, we see now that we can't grow all the time. So that's another thing that kind of the pandemic showed us. So what's your opinion on that?
Yes, actually, as Stefan mentioned earlier, I don't think that, you know, capitalism is good or bad in itself, because basically it does not include moral and it doesn't have any responsibility. So we don't necessarily have to, you know, check capitalism in a being, but I think that the trick is to just like tweak it or reform it into like in a perhaps more intelligent ways. And actually there's a new movement among economists, which is called like economics, who is advocating for a new form of capitalism without that says that we should actually use like all the resources that are available, but in a more responsible way, and not in the purpose of growing again and again, but to use them in like in the environmental limits. And also for the advocates for, like, I would say, like a society that is more fair, that benefits everyone. And I think it's interesting because I've seen with, for example, the microfinance movement, the co-ops movement, that people are ready to jump into a sort of new capitalisms.
Thank you. Yeah, we also see like a shift of wealth currently due to the pandemic. So maybe you can say a few words about that, Stefan.
Yeah, I mean, we see if we talk about income inequality, there are two dimensions. One is across countries, and you see that the advanced economies are doing relatively well overall, because at least in the short term, if you look at GDP, because they can afford extraordinary fiscal and monetary support, which less developed countries cannot do, and they're first in line to be vaccinated. I mean, you see who got the vaccines first, the countries who paid the most. That was Israel, the US, and the UK. The European Union and Switzerland paid less, and they are next in line. But then, I mean, think about African countries, think about Asian countries, or Latin American countries being less able to pay, and they fall back. And so we see a widening in income inequality at the global scale, but also within countries, you see who's hit hardest. I mean, as I said time and again, my income has not decreased by $1. Not at all. I was not affected. I don't have to travel that much. I even save more money. So, I mean, many people at the higher end of the income scale, they're not suffering. But those who are losing their job, those who work in restaurants and other service industries, are the ones at the lower wage range. And so, yeah, income inequality is probably increasing, and that in itself might call for a bigger role of the government. But I would point out that it's not like the government is small by any measure. and it's not getting smaller. It's not like the share of government intervention in the economy, or if you divide public spending by GDP, that has not decreased. That is a myth that has been told. I mean, the Reagan years and so on. Yeah, there has been pockets of deregulation, and they led sometimes to successes, sometimes to failures. But at the end of the day, it's not like we have a small government, not at all. But what we have is often a misguided government that is governed or controlled or influenced by lobbyism. And those can come from the private side. They can also come from the public side. You talk about green energy. I mean, who's asking for green energy? Some companies are asking for it, but also some bureaucrats who know that they can make a career handing out money to companies. So at the end of the day, it's about, I think it's about having the right institutions and the right policies in place, not more or less. It's not about quantity, but rather about the quality of the public sector.
Okay, so if I understood Robert correctly, he wishes more government intervention, especially regarding sustainability. Are there other areas where you think more government intervention is helpful if it's competent? Stefan?
Well, it's hard to say. Where do we need more government? I mean, I think in some areas where I see a bigger role should be played by the public sector is in terms of competition law. This is where for a long time the consensus among economists, or at least the mainstream view of the economists, the dominant view, was that unless companies can have pricing power, we don't have to worry about it. And nowadays we see that Amazon, Facebook, and the like, they dominate markets, are very profitable. But that has been largely a result of lacking antitrust. So I would go into antitrust and see a bigger role for the public sector in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. So talking about tricking and maybe from large organizations to smaller ones. So we said that wealth is shifting, and actually access to financial means for example, entrepreneurs or smaller businesses is more difficult. So actually I had a preliminary chat with Helena, and actually she said that actually other countries or also maybe entrepreneurs can actually learn from what she experienced and what's quite common, for example, in the Central African Republic or other countries. So maybe Helena, you can say a few words about microfinance.
Yes, exactly. So what you said is correct. I think that, for example, if you take a country like the Central African Republic, who suffered from, a lot of conflicts and many wars, most of the people who live there, they do not have access to, traditional banks. I mean, the traditional financial system that is available for everyone here in the Western world. So they have to rely on other means. And one of these means is to, save money, but I would say in an informal way. And I've been exposed to that when I was way younger, but I couldn't put a word in it. And it's a little bit later when I started to study economics that I discovered what microfinance was. And actually it is exactly that. So it's basically, it's just like a simple group of people in Central Africa. In the CR, most of the time it's women, they gather together and they organize themselves to save money, to pay the tuition fee for their children, for education in general, for food, for everything. And actually it's working, and it's just that microfinance, when Yunus won the Nobel Peace Prize, he just I would say popularized this movement. But what I would like to talk about more broadly is impact investing, because a few years ago, the world community came with a political consensus around the SDGs, which is a nice framework to start building a better world for everyone and our planet. But the problem is, okay, we are now left with a $5 trillion bills, and how? And the question now is, how are we going to finance it? And how are we going to finance our future? And I think that impact investing, although it is not perfect, although it is really small, I think that it is one of the tools that we can actually use to channel the money where it normally doesn't flow. So in community that are deprived for the money, like just to simply survive. And so what it does is that it connects institutional investors who actually have a desire to clean their balance sheets, to disinvest from the brown economy, to then reinvest this money into green economy in exchange of returns, in exchange of profits, right? We cannot. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to Robert, because you said you see the key role for driving sustainability is a public sector. So what do you think about impact investing? Is it a nice thing to do, or can it really have an impact? Or what do you see are other drivers for sustainability in the future?
Well, the first thing we need in order to improve the delivery of positive results from impact investing are, as Stefan earlier had mentioned, we need stronger rules. We need better policies. And so if the public sector can make better policies, then all of the investors are caught in a new environment, and they react quickly to adapt to that new environment, and they try to make money in that new environment. So, for instance, one of the greatest policies that is most needed right now would be a carbon tax in order to protect us from going further and having more extreme climate change in the future. So a carbon tax is essential right now. No one likes it, but governments can't seem to agree that they are maybe willing to enact a carbon tax at a national level. And one of the reasons is no government wants to move alone, because they're concerned about the competitiveness of their industries, of their firms, vis-a-vis firms and industries in other countries where a carbon tax might not be present. And so what you need to do is somehow, and this is what the UN tries to do through the Climate Change Convention process, and also the WTO tries to get governments together, and to get them to all agree that, yes, let's all do this, so there's no first mover. And if we all do it together, we change the environment globally for investment. And the carbon tax is there, and it's a new reality. And companies and investors will now interact within this new reality, and will have lower emissions. So if the rules of the game, it's as Stefan said very clearly, if it's a football game and you don't have any rules, then it's a free for all. But if you have rules and everybody has to act within that regime of rules, then you can get some positive results.
Thank you, Robert. I have one question from the audience. So it's, what are the specific measures governments can take to change the economic system, and which actually work? Maybe to Stefan.
How many hours do I have to answer that question? It's a very broad question. I mean, what should be changed? I mean, of course, you can mention endless things, but I think the crucial point is you want to understand that there are certain problems that you will have to deal with no matter what system you have. And one of the problems is coordinating production processes. As someone years ago pointed out, even if you want to produce something as simple as a pencil, you need thousands and thousands of people to collaborate. I mean, how do you get the wood? How do you get the wood from some place to another place? You need ships, you need trucks, you need a chainsaw to cut the tree, and so on and so forth. You need the graphite inside, you need the color. I mean, even a very simple product requires the collaboration of lots and lots of people in very different industries, different countries. And now think about a smartphone. I mean, and the question is, what system allows this kind of collaboration? And the market system, or private market system, capitalist system, is just a mechanism for coordination. And I think Andrew pointed out at the very beginning that we need more control and coordination. The question is, who should control? Do you want to have some bureaucrats setting the rules? If they're competent, that might work. But there's another way of dealing with the problem, and that's called the price system. And if you have the proper institutional setup, then the price system will do wonders, as it has done for decades. So what should be changed? I think you should look at where things are going wrong. And one is climate change, one is environmental pollution, one is inequality. And then you have to look not at the symptoms, but at the underlying causes. If you go to a doctor and you say, I'm in pain, the doctor will be a very bad doctor if he or she just treats the pain with painkillers. The doctor has to ask what is causing it. And I think capitalist system is a mechanism. You can use it, but you should understand how it works. And then you set up the proper institutions, and then you get the results you aim for.
So basically you're saying it's a matter of supply chain transparency and supply chain collaboration?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, you know, in terms of supply chains, we learned in COVID-19 how important they are and how fragile they sometimes are. And, you know, if you have managers who only look at the next quarter, they might not make certain investments to build up resilience, because those come at a cost and the benefit might come years later. So, yeah, I mean, it's often in the details we have to make the improvements. I don't like those very big plans of changing things. Go down to the details, and often it's local. I fully agree with Helena. I mean, national circumstances matter, and policies that might be suitable for Switzerland might not be suitable for Central Africa. And we shouldn't try to pretend that we know what works in Central Africa if we've never been there, and we don't know how people think and behave over there. They have different preferences, different values, different traditions, and all of that has to be taken into account as well.
So you say we need local competence?
Yes, yes, and I would think that a lot of less developed countries would be happy if they don't have constantly people from outside telling them what to do, and sometimes destroying their markets.
But how do we get there? To get
I agree with Robert.
Right
I agree with Robert that we need some international leadership and coordination. And to some extent, we need some leading countries. That can be the European Union, and that can be the United States. I fully agree with Robert that we need to compromise so that there's no free riding. But it's hard, if you talk about climate change, who should reduce by how much? And at some point, the richer countries should take a step forward and say, okay, I can shoulder the bigger part of the cost. In the interest of having a solution overall. If you nitpick and you fight about every benefit, as we've seen in the past 4 years in the United States, then we're not moving forward. We need leadership, and we need some of the more, you know, developed and richer countries to play a bigger role and to guide policies, and to some extent to subsidize poorer countries or to support them, quite frankly, because we can afford.
Thank you. I have a number of questions. So let's start with one on climate change. It's besides carbon tax, what other tools are available to policymakers regarding climate change? Robert.
Well, the nice thing about the carbon tax is it solves all of the problems of the externalities, because they're no longer external. They're internal to any type of decision making by an investor. They'd have to look at the costs of polluting with CO2, or you also have to look at methane and other gases. But in the case of carbon dioxide, carbon tax works perfectly. Okay, you could have a number of other incentives, like you could provide subsidies, state subsidies for renewable energy development in countries. You could also have penalties on continued use of fossil fuel. You could reduce fossil fuel subsidies, which make those types of oil and gas and coal burning facilities profitable. There are going to be sunk investments that will be lost, because a lot of investors have invested in fossil fuel power generation. And these are projects that have 20, 30-year timeframes. And so how do you cut that off? How do you say, okay, now you're going to be penalized because, okay, it wasn't in the original calculation when investors invested in fossil fuels, but it has become one, and they're going to have to deal with it. So you would have to have losses. And despite all of the lobby groups that will be lobbying against any type of new policies that might hurt them, you have to have competent government officials who are willing to take the type of resistance that they're going to get from these lobby groups and say, sorry, we are representing the entire country, social values of the entire population and not just the restricted minority values of your investors in this particular industry. And so it's going to be harsh, but that's what has to happen.
Thank you. So for me, it's a question. I mean, Stefan, you said things have to happen more locally. So I mean, we talked about things that might be very relevant to maybe Switzerland or Germany. But Helena, how do you see it for example, Central African Republic? I mean, is sustainability a big topic, or how can you encourage there to be more sustainable? I mean, it will. I'm not sure. Will it also be the carbon regulations?
Unfortunately, right now, this year, sustainability is not a priority because they are facing biggest challenges, such as I mean, there's a big political crisis happening right now. So. But when I talked earlier about impact investing, what I like with impact investing is that it actually has the power to empower people. You know, it's not just a charity who decides what is a worthwhile cause or not, where they want to invest. No, you give the money to someone, and this person decides in which business they want to invest to sustain themselves year after year, and then generate a profit that will sustain an entire family. And actually, for me, that's how impact should work, you know? Like, you start from the individual level, and then perhaps at the community or even at the country level, we will reach a level where everyone is better off. But, you know, I think that we need to start with small steps. And this is perhaps a small steps, as I said. Impact investing is, you know, a very, I would say, like kind of a very small business. It's a very recent business. We started to talk about this like only 20 years ago, and same with microfinance. But at least it's something, you know, it's a start. And for, you know, this kind of country, it actually matters a lot. Right now in the Central African Republic, we only have 4 or 5 microfinance institutions. So it's not a lot compared to other countries in Africa or even in Asia or in Latin America, where it's much more developed. But I mean, we don't have that many tools at our disposal. That's the problem when the state is very weak and very prone to, you know, a lot of, distortions or violence. So people have to, you know, take their own destiny at hand, because it's the only solution. And microfinance, even Islamic finance, you know, have a big role to play. And if investors are willing to invest into this small institution, it can make a difference. It can make an impact.
Okay, perfect. Thank you a lot. That's interesting. We actually have another couple of questions. I'm not sure if you will make all of them, but what could be then the impact of the coming UN Climate Change Conference, Glasgow COP26 on sustainable capitalism? Who of you wants to answer it? Or can answer it?
Sustainable capitalism. Does that mean capitalism that protects the climate system? I would assume so. What you need to do is, you know, stop the delaying. I mean, it was in 2009, I believe, in Copenhagen, where the target was set that we will not exceed 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels in our fight against climate change. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, which followed that, and by the way, it took another 6 or 7 years before you got to the Paris Agreement, so nothing was done during that time. And then the Paris Agreement doesn't even come into effect until 2020, and nothing's done for those 3 or 4 years that pass by. And so there's a lot of delaying. There's a lot of pledges. There's a lot of expressions of great endeavors by governments, but nothing's actually happening. And so action has to happen, and, you know, decisions have to be made. And so that's what I think is going to be important, is that hopefully we don't get at Glasgow a number of great statements by governments with these wonderful pledges, but then no delivery. And that's what we're used to. We just had in Washington last Thursday and Friday. A number of countries met in a meeting that was convened by Joe Biden in order to get countries to strengthen their commitments to reduce emissions. And we have a number of pledges made. We have a number of countries that balked and didn't say anything and didn't make new pledges or strengthen their existing commitments. However, if you look at all of that and you look at current commitments under the Paris Agreement, we're headed for 3 degrees higher than pre-industrial temperatures by 2100. So we're far off of the 1.5 degree target that we had originally set ourselves for. Hopefully in Glasgow, some real commitments are made. And it's important what Stefan mentioned. Developing countries need financing, not only to emit less and to mitigate climate change, but they're going to be the hardest hit by climate change. It's in the tropics that the temperatures increase is going to affect economies the most. So you're going to have a loss of agricultural productivity, a loss of fishery productivity, a loss of tourism productivity. These countries in the middle latitudes are going to suffer the most. And we will suffer relatively little here in Europe and in the temperate climates. Yeah, we'll get a little warmer, but it's not going to become critical. And so we really need to help finance adaptation in developing countries. And they need the money, and they deserve the money, because most of the emissions to date since industrial period began have been from developed countries. So it's a little bit of it's a payback time now too.
Thank you, Robert. I think actually our time is over. So I think that was a good closing statement. Maybe Stefan and Helena, you can say 1-2 sentences for yeah, just to sum up your opinion or your vision. And then we didn't answer all the questions, but you can all ask in the Q&A session afterwards. So Stefan.
Well, I would agree that you know, largely we had a very good discussion here, and it seems like there is a consensus that it's a challenging time. There are many issues on the plate, which makes it harder. Helena pointed out this at the very beginning, that there are many challenges to deal with, and they're not easy. They call for leadership, they call for skills. And since we're working at a university here and we're holding this at a university, what we need is education, not more people with university diplomas, but actually education. People who are able to think, to see the trade-offs, to see the incentives involved, and to understand that there are national contexts. And just a closing statement on Central African Republic, should they do more about climate change? Well, if you have an iPhone, the iPhone is worth more than the national or the average income in that country. So are you seriously asking them to fight climate change? I would say we have to do more, and we have to work harder in the rich countries and support those who are suffering the most during COVID-19. And those are, unfortunately, the poorer countries.
Thank you, Stefan, for working on the education problem and dedicating your days to teaching and researching in economics. Yeah, Helena, please.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with Robert and Stefan. We have a lot of pushing issues, but as you pointed out earlier, Stefan, different countries, different problems. But overall, we all agree that yeah, we need to find new ways of, you know, doing business, and we need to find ways to regulate the society we are in, and especially we need to address the financing problem. Yes, it's nice to have you know, discussions about about the vulnerabilities of our systems, but I think that as you said, Stefan, education is the key, definitely. But in developing countries, how do you finance education? And I think that this is where impact investing, microfinance, or even the co-ops movement have a role to play. And I hope that in the next year, this movement will develop way more than it is today.
Thank you. Thank you all for the interesting discussion and for your different points of views, even though you didn't disagree as much as I was wishing for. And Yeah, I would like to hand over to Luca that will basically moderate the question from the audience. And yeah, thank you. We will see us later in the Wonder Me session, right?
Thank you, Priscilla.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot, Priscilla.
So thanks to all of you for this wonderful panel discussion. It was really interesting, and it's too bad that it has to end already, because I know personally I could have gone a bit longer with that, but good things have to end. So let's start the Q&A. Feel free to unmute yourself, ask your questions, or you can type them on the chat, and I'll read them for you. And yeah, if there's no questions, I'll already go with the questions on the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. So we have a question from the audience. Are networks of closely connected corporate elites an effective way to make corporate governance work more toward the long term? Question mark. Does such a situation disempower the average citizen and thus create a trade-off? You can also see the questions on the chat directly if you need to.
Okay, I'm just wondering if we're talking about an elite sort of business network like the Davos Forum, which has really been ineffective in doing much of anything over the past 20 years.
Robert, I think it refers to the Deutschland AG. It's a relatively stable and collusive type of network of companies that collaborate in some sorts. In the good way, you can think about the Deutschland AG was there are some banks and some car manufacturers and some suppliers, and they all know each other. And right. They have long-term relationships with each other. That can work. It's a model that can work. It worked to some extent in Germany. You have in Korea, you have South Korea, that is, the Chaebol. You have the Kairatsu system in other places. That system can work. It can provide stability. But like other conglomerates, it can also fail spectacularly, and it can lead to collusive behavior. Right. And if you add the government to that, it can be very disastrous. So it is an approach, with the right incentives, it can work. But I think people associate a very good time with the Deutschland AG, which was not caused so much by the setup of the businesses, but rather by the fortunate circumstances after World War II, when Germany was recovering from the war and had this economic miracle.
Perfect, thank you very much. But just to follow up on the question, wouldn't such collaboration also then create legal issues actually regarding cartel law, etc.? That would be limitations toward it actually in the applicability of it.
Yeah, that's why you don't have it so much in the Anglo-Saxon world. The idea of some suppliers closely collaborating with other companies would be a case for antitrust very quickly. Whereas in Europe, one was more lenient towards this idea. But I think in the European Union nowadays, it would be harder as well, for better or worse.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, even in Switzerland, although such type of arrangements might have been very effective in the past, they no longer are. I mean, you can see that it's no longer just Migros and Co-op, which are selling us consumer products at our supermarkets today, but the government decided to let in foreign competition like Aldi's or like Lidl. And so you have a much more diverse set of providers now providing the market in Switzerland, and I think the benefit has been for consumers. And so you don't always get the best arrangement when you allow just a few national firms to control the market.
Thank you very much. And we can also see with the EU taking action now against these big tech is also a sign that there's actions and antitrust, which is really something, I guess, that governments are trying to break break down on. Is there any other question from the audience?
Yeah, I might have a question more towards Helena, and I guess more the situation with COVID in Africa, because honestly, I have to say in Europe, at least, it was kind of, we never really talked about the situation, especially like, yeah, I guess in sub-Saharan countries. And I was wondering, how did they deal with COVID? Did they found opportunities, like political opportunities maybe as well, to kind of play with COVID? Because I've heard a few things about this, you know, just putting lockdown when they felt like it, for example. So how was the situation, and how did you see the situation there economically and politically, I guess, as well?
It's hard to answer this question because I mean, Africa is a whole continent, and we don't observe the same situation in every country. But I would say that from the CRA, okay. For the CRA, it's a little bit complicated in the sense that COVID is just one more crisis. You know, it's not even that. I mean, of course, it impacted a lot of people, but I would say that it impacted less than the financial crisis that we are dealing with. You know, also the political crisis. We are supposed to have elections, but we had elections, but it didn't solve anything. We have, you know, this crisis between Christians and Muslims. I mean, there's a lot going on in this country that I would say that, you know, COVID, we don't have, the government doesn't have the money to support people, actually. So the people, they just try to cope as much as they can, but I wouldn't say that the COVID-19 crisis changed a lot of things there, to be totally honest. I think that there's a lot of, if you look at the neighbors countries, like for example, Cameroon, I think that they managed way better the crisis than the Sierra. I don't know about Chad because I mean the president recently died recently, unfortunately, and I'm afraid that the situation will get worse than it was already before. So, yeah, the thing is that in a lot of African countries, COVID was not such a big topic as it is currently in the Western world, in the sense that the government, they just don't have the means to solve the problem. So people are just living with it. Sometimes there's a lot of death, but how can we do? The health system is in crisis in most of these countries. So yeah, they just have to cope with it and wait for it to pass. And it's a very sad constat, unfortunately. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Perfect. So maybe just one quick last one, and then we can end the Q&A. So what is your view on the Gini index as a tool to judge the development of capitalism? Who would like to answer this one?
The problem with the Gini index is it's, if you look at income inequality, and there's a body of literature now, and I work with Emmanuel Saez, who's a co-author of Thomas Piketty. So I know that literature quite well, and the people behind it. And what they find out is that the Gini coefficient doesn't move that much, or doesn't have to move that much up or down. It's a measure between 0 and 1. 1 means total inequality, and 0 means total equality, for those who don't know. But most of the action takes place at the very extreme level, the top 1%. This is where most of the action takes place. And the Gini coefficient doesn't really tell you a lot about how income inequality is evolving, because most of the action takes place at the extreme tails of the distribution. And if you actually look at the Gini coefficient, then it's also hard to measure, because how do you factor in over time? You say it's a measure of how well capitalism is doing. How do you measure incomes over time? The inflation rate, you have a measure of inflation, but that's just an average basket of goods, and that varies vastly across people. the inflation rates that people actually face. Then you have to factor in a monetary policy, which has in Europe and the US and other parts of the world, inflated asset prices, so that everyone who's at the very end of the very right-hand side of the income or wealth distribution benefited tremendously. So, a Gini coefficient is one index you can look at, but you don't find a lot of action there. And that doesn't suggest that inequality is not changing. It is, but you have to look more into the details to actually understand what's going on.
Yeah, that's great. Stefan, I think, gave an excellent description of the limitations of the Gini coefficient. I mean, just to put in layman's terms, the richest 1% of the world's population today owns 44% of global wealth, while the poorest 50% own less than 2% of global wealth. And that's a recent figure coming from the Overseas Development Institute. I think that is, in layman's terms, it's more readily apparent how big the gap in income has become, and this is becoming more polarized, and the richest are becoming richer, having more of the wealth, the poorest becoming poorer, having less of global wealth over the past 30 to 40, 50 years. And so there's a real problem that continues to become more substantial with time. And there are government policies, again, that can sort of correct this. Why does production by major multinational companies and value added have to occur in the developed countries? Why can't more of that be done in developing countries? So instead of just taking raw resources from Africa and commodities, actually have the value added take place there. Well, governments need to create incentives, or I would say incentives first, penalties later, but incentives could be very useful to give tax breaks to companies that build value-added production facilities in some of these poor countries in order to raise living standards there and to increase incomes for workers in these countries. Because if we don't take care of this income inequality today, it will be aggravated by climate change. That's one thing. And secondly, it's going to lead to big migration flows in the future, where people can't make a living in developing countries. I mean, we saw mass flows of people from Central America into the United States a year ago. We continue to see a number of migrants from Africa trying to reach Europe, and also from Asia and West Asia. And so this problem is small right now, but it's only going to get bigger unless we do something to correct it and to correct the reasons why people are migrating in the first place. And that needs to happen now. And it's governments that can create incentives to have multinational companies invest in production, more value added in developing countries.